So I'm sure you've seen Yuval's video that has since been taken down, or you've seen a stitch of it, or somebody with their 2 cents. And here I am to put in my 2 cents as somebody who has studied the Holocaust and World War II for 10 years. I've written a course about it. I have taught about it. I'm writing a book about how to teach about World War II better because it's not taught about very well in the United States, and this is very relevant to this conversation. And I'm also writing a very controversial book, a comparative analysis of the genocides and why we only teach about one. This video is going to be really long, and it's going to be several parts, and I'm going to say a lot of words that the algorithm really doesn't like, so make sure to interact, please. So this all started when a black creator said that Israel paid for the Holocaust to be prominent in American and Western education, and they are correct. And then Yuval went on a 7-minute tirade about it. Now, I think Yuval said that word choice matters, and it does, and his word choice was not super great in his video. So when you say Israel paid for Holocaust education, what you mean is Israeli lobbyists, Israeli organizations, and organizations like the United Holocaust Memorial Museum paid for it.
The reason why most people think that the Holocaust is the worst tragedy to ever happen to humanity in the modern era is because Israel paid for that to be the reality, because the numbers just actually aren't there.
Yes, they are. You have to be so willfully detached from reality to even begin to suggest that the only reason that the Holocaust is taken as seriously as it is because Israel paid for it.
Saying things like this really triggers some people because it makes you think that it's an anti-Semitic trope of the Jews control the world with money. Now that is anti-Semitic, but it's factual to say that Israeli organizations lobby for Holocaust education. Israel has in fact paid for it since the late 1960s, and until then there were only a few books, namely a book by Hannah Arendt and another by Raoul Hilberg, and those were very controversial. Raoul actually had over 20 members of his family perish in the Holocaust, so he's very connected to this, and he's one of the leading prominent Holocaust historians. And when his book came out, The Destruction of the European Jew, everyone was like, no, we don't want to dredge up the past. Don't talk about it. Especially American Jews who wanted to distance themselves from Israel. In 1967, after the Israelis won in an Arab-Israeli war, the US decided that Israel would be a good proxy for power in the Middle East. And that's when people started to remember the Holocaust and fear this propaganda that there would be a second Holocaust to come. That's why they needed all this power. That, along with saying that anything that is criticism of Israel is just inherently anti-Semitic, is all part of Israeli propaganda to garner support and deflect criticism.
I want to be clear, I think it's strange to say anything is the worst thing to ever happen in human history because I think it is bizarre to rank tragedies.
Many people have pointed out the pure irony in you saying that it's bizarre to compare or rank tragedies, and then you go on to promote the complete uniqueness of the Holocaust, thereby ranking it above everything else.
But I also think it is very weird to respond to somebody who's saying, I think X is the worst thing to ever happen to humankind, whether that be the Holocaust, slavery, colonialism, and respond by going, well, actually, and then citing some other event that had a larger body count.
Are you not actualing her?
There are quite a few things that do make the Holocaust uniquely horrific, even within the context of the history of genocide.
The only thing that is completely unique, never been done before in the Holocaust, was the sheer size and magnitude, the industrialization of the killing process. That's unique. However, the gas was invented in America. Zyklon B, we used it on Mexican migrant workers, and the mobile gas trucks that they used at first were invented in the Soviet Union. Segregation laws, taken from Jim Crow laws. Eugenics, taken from American eugenics and other European eugenics. Everything had been done before, to some extent. Gas chambers weren't new, but the size, I'll give you that. But that's not enough to say that the Holocaust cannot be compared to anything else. The Holocaust exceptionality is part of the propaganda that certain organizations and countries push in order to keep that genocide at the top of everything else. Sometimes people are confused with the idea of comparing genocides because they think that means you are ranking them. Ranking and comparing are similar but not identical, and it is in fact this idea of Holocaust exceptionality. That's the ranking. They're putting that above everything else. Comparing is just saying, look at the similarities, not this one is better or worse.
You need to remember, it is not just the death toll that is significant here. Obviously, if you compare the Holocaust to something like the Atlantic slave trade, something that took place over the course of 250 years, the death toll is going to pale in comparison.
In the transatlantic slave trade, about 13 million Africans were brought to the Americas. That does not include the amount who died on the ships coming here, or the people who died on the walks, the death marches from the middle of Africa to the camps on the coast, and then in the camps where they were literally beaten into submission. Doesn't include all those millions of deaths. But because that happened over the course of, 250 years, it's not good enough.
Remember, the Holocaust happened over 4 years. That's it. 6 million Jews killed in just 4 years.
It's important to be precise, so it's actually 5 years, not 4. If you're basing it off of the date that the first death camp opened, 5 full years of the Holocaust, but almost 6 years of the war.
That is an average of 4,000 people killed a day. During the worst 100-day stretch of the Holocaust, nearly 1.5 million Jews were killed, averaging over 14,000 Jews a day.
Since it's actually 5 years, the per-day death rate is actually a low of 2,790 and a high of 3,287 per day, on average. You are close on the 100-day surge in 1942, when about 1.47 million Jews died in that time frame.
This is not even including the 5 million non-Jews that were killed during the Holocaust, so in truth, all these numbers are almost double.
It is interesting that you choose the high end of the estimate for Jews, but you don't even hit it close to the low end of the estimate for the other people. The low estimate that Raoul Hilberg published, who is a Holocaust historian, is 5.1 million Jewish deaths, and the highest estimate is 6.3 million. The other people that you don't talk about that were killed in the Holocaust was 12 million as a lowest estimate and 24 million as a highest estimate. And that's all civilians.
It's not even including the 5 million non-Jews that were killed during the Holocaust, so in truth, all these numbers are almost double. You're going to struggle to find that kind of rate.
Forgive me, for I'm going to read off of my computer screen to get these numbers correct, because this is from my book that I'm writing about genocides. 1 million non-Slavic Polish civilians were killed by the Germans, and it shouldn't be forgotten that 150,000 Poles were also killed by the Soviets. 10.3 to 21.77 million Slavic people were killed by the Germans. That's just civilians. That breaks down into 4.5 up to 10 million Soviet civilians who died due to direct war violence, like bombing raids, executions, etc. And another 4 to 9 million Soviet civilians who died from war-related disease or famine. And another 1.8 to 2.77 million ethnic Polish people. They were Slavic people. 250,000 disabled civilians, and 250,000 to 500,000 Romani and Sinti people, and 300,000 to 400,000 people were legally sterilized. Many thousands of them were forcibly sterilized, though, but we don't know the numbers of that. But out of the people who were sterilized, many thousands of them died from unclean surgical practices or a non-existence of pain management. Thousands more deaths from groups such as Catholics, Jehovah's Witnesses, the queer community, criminals, or asocials as they called them, civilian resistance members, etc., etc. Not to mention the 5,000 disabled, mostly autistic kids that they just thought were psychopaths and unfit for society.
That is an average of 4,000 people killed a day. During the worst 100-day stretch of the Holocaust, nearly 1.5 million Jews were killed, averaging over 14,000 Jews a day.
What about Rwanda, since you want to rank genocides based on a per-day death rate? Rwanda was 100 days long, and it had 1 million deaths. The average daily death rate is 10,000, with some days surging well over 14,000. I forgot to add, so I had to come back to this. What about the British occupation of India? In 89 years, 100 to 150 million people died. Someone do the math for me on that, on how many people per day that is.
That it was just barbarism and savagery.
And on the topic of countries that people deem as savages, therefore okay to colonize, what about the indigenous peoples of America? In the first 108 years of colonization, 56 million people died. That's not even including the continued genocide.
Obviously a level of sadism to saying something like, I want what you have and I don't care how you feel about it, right? We expect that out of animals. But there is something very uniquely horrifying about saying, I don't want what you have. I don't want your money. I don't want your land. And in fact, I do care how you feel, in that I want you to suffer.
Careful, you're dabbling in the idea of Jewish exceptionality, that Jewish suffering is more important than anybody else's suffering. You think that no other genocide intended for people to suffer, that the Jewish Holocaust was the only one that wanted them to suffer? You think that?
They industrialized the process of killing in such a systemic and efficient way never seen before or since.
Since you want the Holocaust to be so unique that nothing else compares, sure, the sheer size and industrialization of it is unique.
None of these Jews were incidental deaths. Every single Jew was directly murdered. Nobody died just as a byproduct of some disease spreading through a community.
Hundreds of thousands of Jews, and the others, which you don't name, died of disease and starvation because they actually used disease and starvation as a method, a tactic to eliminate people so that they didn't have to waste more bullets. So if we're going off of the 6 million number, which is generally accepted, I also accept it as the most reasonable estimate. Up to 3 million of them died in a death camp. It's only half. 2 million of them died in a shooting operation somewhere in Eastern Europe, mostly in Ukraine, like 1.5 million of them in Ukraine. And the other 1 million of them died of disease or starvation in a ghetto, or shot in their own home, or in a regular labor camp, not a death camp.
They were all hand-chosen by the millions, then exported to camps where they were either shot, gassed, hanged, or intentionally starved to death.
Right, come on now, you're a smart guy. Do you really think that the other genocides did not specifically choose people to kill?
There's a level of premeditation to the Holocaust that I think you will struggle to find anywhere else.
You think that it was all incidental? Do you struggle, perhaps, to understand that other genocides have been premeditated? That's not a unique thing.
Beforehand. Do we get that? Even like beyond the industrialization of it, they created a blueprint for extermination. Their goal was to kill all Jews in Europe.
I said this in one of the other videos, but the US used Zyklon B first. The Soviet Union used the mobile gas trucks first. The gas chambers weren't new. The eugenics was all over the place. And the segregation laws that they based the Nuremberg laws on were Jim Crow laws. We were the blueprint for them.
Just shot in their houses or hacked by giant militias.
Yes, sometimes they were.
The most effective genocide in human history. There's a reason it's called the Holocaust.
The reason that it is called the Holocaust is also Israeli propaganda. The word is simply a synonym for genocide. And when Raphael Lemkin, a Jewish man, created that word in 1944, he was like, look, this keeps happening. That's what's happening to the Jewish people right now, and it keeps happening. And he named a bunch of other genocides, and then a couple decades later, Israel was like, that's our word. You can't use that word to describe anything else. And if you say anything else was a Holocaust, you're anti-Semitic because you're denying the complete uniqueness of the Holocaust. Organizations like the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem have wanted to erase all mention of other people that were killed during that time frame because they wanted it to be a completely unique experience for Jewish people. And very strong voices in that argument were Yehuda Bauer and Elie Wiesel, the author of Night, who, by the way, was completely indifferent to the suffering of Palestinians and denied that that genocide happened. Do you remember his quotes, right? Do you remember those?
They killed 2/3, 67% of all Jews across a continent.
Now you want to compare based on percentages? Okay, bizarre, but we'll go with it. How about the percentage of Romani people who were killed? Before World War II, it's estimated that 1 to 1.5 million Romani people existed in Europe. Birth records are not the best. But if you want to go with the highest estimate for Jewish people who were killed, let's go with the highest estimate for Romani people, 500,000. So that is 1/3 to 1/2 of all Romani people in Europe. But they generally are not included in Holocaust education, and I've heard that at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, there's just like a small little section on them in the basement because they originally did not want to include them. Even though the Nuremberg laws, which were the laws that segregated Jewish people, also included Romani and black people, like in the law.
Something uniquely sadistic about the motivations behind the Holocaust. It wasn't under the guise of economic reasons. It wasn't let's enslave the Jews to get their free labor.
But they did enslave them for free labor before they killed them. In fact, that's how it all began in 1933 when Dachau was opened. And it wasn't just Jewish people.
It wasn't for territorial advantage. It wasn't, we want your land and we'll kill you in the process to get it.
Was it not territorial motivations when they wished to conquer all of Poland for the land so that they could expand their empire? Was it also not territorial when they designed the General Plan Ost, which was the literal plan to take over all of the Eastern European countries, enslave and kill all of the Slavic people there? Plan which succeeded in killing 7 million Soviet civilians, including the 2 million Jewish Soviets.
It wasn't motivated by barbarism, by apathy, not even greed. It was literally nothing other than pure vitriolic hatred.
Say that there was no greed when they stole land, money, and possessions from their victims is so far detached from reality. There was apathy, greed, and hate, and to pretend like there was only one motivation is really strange.
People say that the only reason the Holocaust is regarded as severely as it is because of where it happened. And yes, that is absolutely true. But that's also very important to consider here.
There it is. That's why it's the most important, because it happened in Europe to white people.
Just that it happened within a civilized society.
By civilized, you mean white. What's really interesting about that is Eastern Europeans and Jews were not considered white enough. But now Jewish people have this proximity to whiteness.
But Germany specifically was seen as the peak of civilization globally.
Germany specifically was not the peak of civilization. That's a weird claim to make and a hard one to prove. They may have had intellectuals and philosophers and good music, but after World War I, they were poor as shit. They weren't leading the world in anything until the 1930s when they began enslaving people for free labor. However, if Germany was the peak of civilization, and that's why the Holocaust mattered the most, because it happened in a civilized society, then why aren't the 2 genocides that Germany committed in Africa also important? So from 1904 to 1908, in German Southwest Africa, which is modern-day Namibia, they killed up to 110,000 Africans. And during the same time frame, from 1905 to 1907, in German East Africa, which is modern-day Tanzania, where up to 300,000 Africans were killed. They were killed by violence, famine, and disease because they intentionally starved them out. That's a tactic they used kind of everywhere.
In some far-off corner of the world contained to a single country.
Do you mean a non-white country that the white countries historically didn't care about?
Or that it was just barbarism and savagery?
I really hope that you don't mean that genocides that were committed by non-white people were because they were just barbarians. But what about genocides where white people committed it against non-white people? Why aren't those studied?
People say that the only reason the Holocaust is regarded as severely as it is because of where it happened. And yes, that is absolutely true.
Interestingly, when Raoul Hilberg, the Holocaust historian, published his first study on it in 1961 called The Destruction of the European Jews, people were unconcerned, not like they are now. They didn't want to dredge up the past and ruin any relations with any countries. And especially in America, people were unbothered by what happened in another continent to people that they really didn't like either, because as you know, anti-Semitism runs deep here.
I think what's particularly difficult for people to wrap their heads around is that Hitler did not really need to resort to force to do this. He wasn't Stalin. The people just worshipped him.
He didn't necessarily, but he and Stalin were pretty similar, actually, and people did worship him. But to say that no one feared him or no one was coerced is wrong.
What's really frustrating about this video that I'm responding to in particular is that I actually agree with their overarching point, which is that we tend to teach history in a very linear way. We focus on single events as opposed to teaching history more thematically.
If you agree that focusing on a single event, which is the Holocaust, is a poor way to teach history, then why do you insist on the uniqueness of the Holocaust and its importance? That's part of the propaganda. I recommend this book to you, The Holocaust Industry by Norman Finkelstein. Both of his parents survived, and he's been a fierce advocate against Israel, criticizing them and, as he calls it, their perpetual victimhood and the exploitation of the Holocaust. And he's been an advocate for Palestine the entire time. While you're at it, read this one. It's about the misuse of anti-Semitism, also by Finkelstein. He's been called an anti-Semite forever. He's Jewish. This isn't exactly what we've been talking about, but it's along the same lines. Read anything by Ilan Pappé. This one will dispel some of the propaganda. This will explain the lobbying that Israel does in America so that we promote Holocaust education and deals and money for them. Anything by Noam Chomsky and Ilan Pappé. They've written a couple books together. They're both Jewish, and they've both been called anti-Semites for speaking on this. And this one is a unique one because not many people have heard of it. It's very short, but it has like I don't know, 1,000 references in the back. It's fantastic.
I always hate videos like these because they remind me how the Holocaust happened.
What if the propaganda is this overreaching fear of a second Holocaust happening, but at the hands of the Arabs this time, and saying things like, "This is how it happened," is a warning. It's propaganda.
Because they're always guised as intellectualism.
Just a question, are you familiar with feigning intellectualism?
And then you look at their comment section, and it's not even remotely guised anti-Semitism. Remember,
You're blaming her for the comment section, which she's not engaging with those comments or liking them or anything, but you're blaming her for it. She didn't say anything anti-Semitic or insinuate that the Holocaust didn't happen. One of the unfortunate byproducts of Israel's aggression, and as some call it, their perpetual victimhood, is that it's creating more real anti-Semitism in some people who may not have been anti-Semitic before. To cry laughing that the Holocaust is shoved down our throats is indeed a little bit anti-Semitic, but it's not anti-Semitic to say that the Holocaust has a heavy focus in Western education, while we don't really learn about any other genocide. That's just factual. Say that you don't believe in the Holocaust anymore is anti-Semitic, but to question the amount of Holocaust education we receive in Western nations and what propaganda might be pushed, just to question it, that's not inherently anti-Semitic, but that's what Israel wants you to believe. There is a fine line between saying the Jews control the narrative and saying that Jewish organizations and museums and lobbyist groups push to have the importance and the uniqueness of the Holocaust above everything else. Because saying this is one of the most age-old anti-Semitic tropes. But saying anything to the tune of it is a very fine line that you've got to draw.
back in October, seeing a video by a large creator who claimed that the term anti-Semitism was created by Israel to justify its existence.
The word anti-Semitism was not created by Israel, but it has been weaponized by Israel purposefully to deflect any criticism that they might receive for what they are doing. Jews, Israelis, and Holocaust survivors have been called anti-Semites for decades because they've been advocating for Palestinian rights and criticizing Israel's actions. Organization Jewish Voice for Peace, which has been advocating for Palestine, has been labeled as one of the examples of anti-Semitism by the Anti-Defamation League, which changes the definition of anti-Semitism when they please so that it suits them and their goals. Comparing Israel to the people of Germany from the 1930s and 40s has been anti-Semitic for decades, but the very first people to make that comparison were Jewish Holocaust survivors and Israeli think tanks, and the comparison is illegal in Israel and Germany and soon in America. Why would that be illegal? That's what you've got to question, but if you question it, you're anti-Semitic.
I still have a link in my bio for Marwa's family who's trying to save her family from Gaza.
The "I'm a nice guy trying to help a Palestinian family" link in bio at the end was a nice touch.